Folks, welcome. Appreciate you taking some time out of your busy lives to come to an event like this. And I want to thank Carol and George for having me and for the very warm introduction a few minutes ago. It's very tough following David Ruhr and Christine Swire, but I want to give it my best shot. A wise man once told me that you can always tell a person's intelligence by how much they agree with it. So I think this room is very brilliant because you're going to all agree with me that we're here to learn a little bit more about Francis Marion and the folks that served under him. What you're going to hear today is a little bit different. If you do not like details and painful details, you might as well just get up and walk out now. Because you're going to see stuff that is excruciatingly detailed, and I'm not going to read every word, I'm not going to read every slide. I am going to go through it fairly quickly, but you're going to see that I can't cover it all. There is no way I can cover it all. If you guys sat here through it, your eyes would be glazed over, and it's probably going to happen anyway. So, with that said, we're going to talk about 1780. We're going to pass these out. Everybody gets a copy, courtesy copy of the presentation on CD-ROM. I'm only going to talk through 1780, and you can look at the rest of the leisure at home. It's white and swinging. This story is not necessarily just about Marion. This story is about the men supporting Marion. Why did they choose to support him? This story is about the events that shaped his brigade. And we talk a lot about Marion himself and how he came from humble beginnings and rose to a brigadier general. But you have to remember that there are events that shape things. There are preceding events that shape things, and there are after events that shape things. So, without further ado, we'll go into it. So, background. Wow. This is an overview of the whole revolution in South Carolina. You're going to see Continental Congress and key events up here. You're going to see governors, legislature, the provincial Congress, the state Congresses when they met, when the regiments were formed. And you're going to see, essentially, this is our time frame right here. From about May of 1780 to the end of 1782, you'll see that the British took Charleston, Beaufort, Dorchester, Cheraw, etc. And we're going to talk mostly about what happened after the fall of Charleston. So we know that Marion was in the war long before the fall of Charleston. But here's what happened after the fall of Charleston. Just to give you a little more context, in 1682, there were 3 counties created. In 1684, a 4th one, and it got renamed. There are, in your package, you'll see, the definition of Craven County was at Allendale, Berkeley County at another river, etc. They tell you that it's perpendicular to the coast, but they don't tell you how far inland it goes because there wasn't much population. But from 1682 to 1774, those counties continued, and as time went on, they created parishes. And the parishes were ecclesiastical, but they were also military, and they were also political. All of this leads to the formation of how South Carolina defined its military organization. We all know that in the very first of the charters to Carolina, the Lords Proprietors were granted this colony and the right to defend itself. So they were authorized to raise a militia, which they did very soon after settling over here in 1670. The Embassy War was in the early 1700s, and very soon thereafter, they created militia laws of how they would raise troops, train troops, muster troops, etc. It was based on the county and the parish system. way back in the early 1700s. So tradition was started that each county would raise a regiment of militia, and they had to serve for a certain period of time, etc. But each parish had to serve or raise one or two companies of militia. And this led into the war, right up to it. And in 1769, South Carolina created these districts. They weren't embraced by the people, but they wanted to get this into a judicial district, a voting district, as well as a military district. But from 69 to 74, you have these districts. And then you see the old counties and the old parishes overlaid with the new ones. And you see that, oops, wrong one, that, for example, Craven County, they all agreed, included all of this effort here. But look, there's Georgetown District and Charlestown, but Craven County was a little bit of this area right here. And you say, okay, why is that important? Well, the reason this is important is that this is how they organized their militia and how they developed who got to do this, who got to do that. It was all based on legislative power. That was not willy-nilly, let's go create a group of militia. You'll see that in 78, the 96th district was split into upper and lower. But what the split exactly was, who knows? Craven County was as early as 75. Upper Craven and lower Craven. But you see that overlap with these districts that were established, and these counties overlap, and you're like, wait a minute, what are we doing here? Why do we want to do this? Who cares? But it does matter. Interesting note that I'll point out here is I have seen surveys of Edgefield County in the 1760s saying that this plot was surveyed for Craven County. So you're like, well, where did Granville end? Where did Colleton end? They don't really tell us. And there weren't any great surveys. It was just that the locals, indigenous, they knew. So it's like when you talk Granville, they knew, they knew where they did, etc. So going into 74, we're getting into the provincial congresses where South Carolina is sort of transitioning from the royal crown rule to self-rule. They created their own new districts. And you start finding things like the new acquisition district, the upper district. It was started with Upper Saluda, then just the upper, then it became the Spartan. For example, this was Forks of the Saluda, the Dutch Forks district, and then it became the lower district. Then you see these real long names, the district between the Broad and the Catawba River. This is actually the names that these folks gave to their judicial districts, their voting districts, and their military districts. And you're like, what were you thinking? There is no way to shorten this into anything that makes any sense. Over time, in these few years, they broke Orangeburg into 3 districts, and I forget what this one was originally, but then they split it even further into the 2 parishes. But you find that they never used those militarily. So it's like, we got the Charles District Regiment, the Georgetown District Regiment, but we do not have the district between the Broad and the Regiment of Militia. And you have to understand that this all sort of evolved naturally, and it becomes important real soon. Get up to the history here. The key roads have overlaid the districts. If you know where the roads are and the rivers are, that's where most of the battles were. That's why this is important. You're going to see that the old King's Highway went all the way to Savannah, and it was a very well-maintained road. The Fall Line Road was also called the Great Wagon Road, and then the upper road. Then you have these little internal roads, and you're going like, okay, well, again, why is this important? Well, it's important because everybody had to transmit across the state, move troops up and down, etc. We heard a lot yesterday about Nelson's Ferry, and it was not really a town, but it was a key post. All these others were towns. Those towns were in existence, and people lived basically all over the state. In 1775, the population of South Carolina was roughly 70,000 whites, over 104,000 slaves. I cannot find what it was in '83, but in 1790, the population was 140,000 whites and over 150,000 slaves. So, South Carolina was one of the few states, along with North Carolina and Virginia, that population increased during the war. And this is because we remember that Fort Moultrie, 76, we kicked the British's butts. They sent them packing back up north. They left us alone. For 76, 77, 78, this place was boring. Here we go. Thank you. All right, so 76, 77, 78, it was boring. So the folks up north were like, hey, let's go to South Carolina. Let's go to North Carolina. Guess what? Most of them went to the backcountry. They didn't come around the coast because the coast was all well settled. So they moved into the backcountry. So as you see here, this is all giving you some background. You learn that the military was organized with the Continental Army, and you had 2 brigadier generals in South Carolina. You had the state troops that were attached to the Continental Army. They had 6 regiments. This is in January of 1780. This is before the British landed. The British landed in February. We had state troops. We only had 1 regiment of state troop that was not assigned to the Continental Army. We had some independent companies, and then we had a whole bunch of regiments of militia. A regiment was led by a colonel. He had a lieutenant colonel and a major under him. These were called field officers. Then they had captains who were the commanding officers of the troops. So typically a regiment was 10 companies or 10 captains. It could be more, it could be less, and each captain was supposed to muster at least 50 men. The militia was basically required for 3 months out of the year. So they had it on rotating basis of January through March, April through et cetera, et cetera. If you were in the January through March, you served for 3 months, you didn't have to come back until January, March of the next year. Okay, so this is mustering. But during this lull time, things got a little haphazard, and everybody got a little bit happy that, hey, nothing going on down here. So mustering men was getting tougher and tougher. In 78, they created the Brigade unit for South Carolina and split it into 4 different brigades with each of these regiments reporting to these brigadier generals. So it was 78 when they first came up with the brigade concept for militia. And they continued that through the end of the war. You're going to see that, for example, this brigade had the Beaufort District Regiment, the Charlestown District Regiment. Can't read, I get glasses on. Okay, that's Colleton County, Granville County, can't read that. 2nd Brigade, you see that there's Fairfield Regiment. Wait a minute, on these other pages I just showed you, there was no Fairfield District. What's happening here? You're going to see that a lot of the names that became counties in 1785, like Fairfield, Chester, etc., came about in the 1770s. But they didn't become official counties or districts, as South Carolina called them in 1800, until 1785. But how they came up with Fairfield, at this point in time, it started as early as 75, but none of the districts match earlier. So there's a lot of exceptions to the rule. Is there anybody here that's not familiar with the post-war granting of federal pensions to survivors of the war? So everybody here is familiar with it. In 1818, the U.S. government authorized survivors of the Continental Army to apply for a federal pension. That was 35 years after the war. Militia could not apply until 1832, almost 50 years after the war. And of course, 50 years after the war, most of the men were dead. But there were a few. If you go to Will Gray's and Leon Harris's website, they have every federal pension application of the Southern campaigns from Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, etc. There's about, what, 20,000 of them on there already? 20, higher, okay, higher than that. This research that you're going to see here is a result of reviewing every pension application for a South Carolina soldier and every pension application for a North Carolina soldier. South Carolina, you can find out there about 4,000 to 4,500 pensions. North Carolina, you can find about 5,500. Most estimates are, over the course of this 8-year war, South Carolina provided about 20 to 25,000 men on the Patriot side. That's not the loyalists. Now some of them went both ways, and they were denied a pension, but at least you know who they were. Some of them could not remember anything except that 30 years, 50 years later, that, hey, I was in the war. And I lived in what is now Marion District, or I lived in what is now Florence District. Well, Florence District didn't happen that time, so we go back to Brigade District. Some men could tell you every officer that they served under, the date that they signed up, the date that they were kicked out, who their sergeant was, who their corporal was, who their captain was, blah, blah, blah. The point being is that of the 20 to 25,000 men that are estimated to be in the South Carolina armies, that includes continentals, state troops, and militias, we can get our heads around about 15,000 of them. So that's pretty doggone good. That's over 50%. But that doesn't mean that we have full coverage. I would like to one of these days get full coverage, but I think that's an impossibility. So moving forward, set the stage. We know how the military is organized. We know where the roads are. We know where the rivers are. We know what's happening everywhere. In February 11th, the British come and land at Edisto and Simmons Island. Simmons Island is now Seabrook. Okay? They brought 8,500 men. Clinton came down because the war was getting boring up north. They had a lot of trouble getting here. They left in December of 79. They got here in February of 1780. They lost some men. They lost a lot of horses. What happens next? They get, and they finally get the capitulation of Charleston on May the 12th. So from February 11th to May the 12th, we're getting towards Charleston. They're digging trenches. They're getting in. And on May the 12th, Charleston finally surrenders. This is just the South Carolina organization at the fall of Charleston. You have to remember that there was North Carolina folks involved, Maryland folks, Virginia folks, and a few Georgians. There were about 6,500 men in this effort. And if you look, you see prisoner of war, 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 bing, 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 surrendered in the backcountry, taken to Jamaica, surrendered in the backcountry, paroled, etc. A lot of folks realized that these men were militia and that they would be back in service fairly quickly. The problem is that you could never find the exact dates when they were officially exchanged and brought back into service. I have seen dates as early as October of 80. I've seen dates as late as February of 81 for some of these men. So we're going to have to realize that things changed. The South Carolina Continental Army was essentially defunct. We all know that Marion was one of the very few that did not get taken, and Christine has already told us why. But what else happened? There may have been a few others that were on parole, but I just haven't been able to find them. But this is what its snapshot looked like. Now, you say, who was my enemy? It's the first time most of you have seen this. This is the British at Charleston. And they had over 12,800 men against our 6,500. And you know that Sir Henry Clinton was the leader of it. Cornwallis was his second in command. Alexander Leslie led all of the British regulars, and he had over 6,000 men. You find a breakdown of what he had serving. Couldn't get all of his on it, so it continues to page 3. A couple of quick notes. You'll find these little triangles in the corner, these are units that stayed behind with Cornwallis after Clinton went back north. So we know who was here, we know who stayed. So you go into the next page, you find out here's the rest of Leslie's men, and these include engineers and etc. In your CD, you'll be able to read it better. We have Hessians coming here. We have a group of loyalists that would not serve under anybody else. They wanted to be directly under Clinton. And then you have folks that were first sent down to Beaufort and to Savannah to round up horses. It wasn't that they didn't land early enough. These are not reinforcements that come because of shipping. It comes because they were, for example, Tarleton landed with no horses. All his horses were swept overboard, and he had to go around scrounging to get horses to get his men, which half were mounted, as well as several others. So Tarleton came back up on page 3. You'll see that he led all of the provincials, but he also had his British Legion. So these are British provincial units, and you see most of these stuck around with Cornwallis afterwards. And you're also going to see that some of these set up outposts. This guy set up Rocky Mount. This guy set up half his regiment to Hanging Rock. This unit was sent to Georgetown, but this man did not. So you start learning who was sent where. This guy eventually took over to New York Volunteers. But essentially, there's the whole organization of the British Army as of May 12th, and who stuck around. So as we mentioned, Charleston was taken. Charleston was occupied. Lieutenant Colonel Nisbet Balfour was the commandant because Clinton went back. Cornwallis went traipsing around, and he left a young lieutenant colonel in charge of Charlestown, and his name was Balfour, and he stays very prominent in the history that moves forward. So they produced all these outposts. Over 30 places they spread out immediately after the capture of Charleston. And you see, guess what? There aren't any over here. Georgetown was taken. It was kept for a long time, and that really ticked off Marion. That was Marion's biggest bone of contention. He wanted Georgetown back because he wanted his whole realm to be free of the British. So that was why he focused on it so much. As you see, Fort Watson was created. The dark means that this was created during the Revolution. The brown means, hey, there was something here before the Revolution, but we converted it into a British fort. For example, Galpin was Patriot, but it was taken over by the British. Granby was Patriot, but it was taken over by the British. 96 was Patriot, but it was taken over by the British. But you'll see, these got kicked out really early. And that it becomes fortuitous for the whole state, but it also comes fortuitous to Marion and his realm of things. Okay, so in June, this is about a month after Charleston was taken, you'll see that what we call military organization no longer exists. There is no organization. The state is in chaos. Rutledge has gone to North Carolina. He's in Hillsborough. The lady who played Miss Pinckney last night said she knew of 3 counselors. I only found 2, so I hope to talk to you after this to get the names of the others. But Mr. Gervais and Daniel Hughie was the 2 that I know.
It's Charles Pinckney II.
Charles Pinckney II. So there's 3 that went with him to Hillsborough. The legislature.
Pinckney went back and surrendered to the British, so he left the city, but he went back to protect it.
Okay, good.
It was only a true that stayed in Rutledge.
Good, okay, good to know. So, what you learn is that the state is in chaos, okay? There's no governor. Christopher Gadsden was taken to St. Augustine, as you heard this morning. He was the lieutenant governor. Most of the legislators just sort of went back home and and try to keep a low profile. There was nobody commissioning new officers. There was nobody directing the militia. There was no Continental Army to direct. There was no, Lincoln, who had surrendered Charlestown, was a prisoner, and he was soon sent to Philadelphia. And of course, there was already some folks marching southward to replace him, but the state here did not know who that would be, nor did they know when it would be. So the 1st Regiment hung around because about 10% of the units were left intact, but by July it was completely disbanded. The 2nd Regiment, same thing. Even though Marion was not captured, he had no men to lead because most of his men were captured. So by July of 1780, there was no more Continental Army in South Carolina except for Brigadier General Isaac Huger. And he was a man without a command, and he had no one to report to. The governor gone, you find out that there are 20 regiments rebuilding. A lot of the men were on parole, and nobody was organizing or pulling them together. The leaders that were not on parole started trying to muster their men. They tried to figure out what they wanted to do next. But 3 guys created new regiments. And this comes from multiple sources, so it's not just made up. Oops, wrong one. Edward Lacey created a group of men right in June. He called it the Cherokee Creek Regiment. Others called it Chester Troops. You would think that it comes from Chester County. Some of his men did, but most of them came from Lancaster and Fairfield County. He had a few from Chester, and that's why he didn't choose the name Chester, but others gave it to him. Colonel James Postell created the Kershaw Regiment. Who authorized these guys? I don't know. I have not found any authorization. But Postell lived in Williamsburg County, what we call Williamsburg County. He had men from Williamsburg, Florence, Clarendon, and a few from Sumter. But he didn't have any from Kershaw. He named it after Joseph and Eli, who were prominent leaders, which became Kershaw County in Camden area, but they were all captured. Postell admired the men, so he named his unit Kershaw Regiment. And for some reason, Lower and Upper Granville got split. Now, this one is really tricky because you got to remember Granville County is where Beaufort is, and Beaufort was occupied. Lower Granville could not muster very many men. And you must see evidence of that here. So why they bothered to split it, because they couldn't muster very many men, I have no idea. But there's enough documentation to show and prove that they separated this regiment and created it by themselves. On their own, under whose authority, I have no idea. But the rest of the guys were just sort of, what do we do now, huh? You're going to see a lot of lieutenant colonels leading. You're going to see that there's no new colonels for a while. And they're like, what do we do? But this is June. We move forward. You're going to see over the course of the next 6 months that I'm going to give you a calendar. This has never been seen before. This is the exact calendar for that month and that year. And as you will see, new moon, full moon, half moons, etc., exact dates. And then I'm going to show you all the battles that transpired during that month. Now, the red means they're not associated with Marion or Marion's Brigade. So these are battles that happened elsewhere. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about those. These were mostly little skirmishes, okay? But it starts filling up really quickly. You get to July, exact dates, when Gates comes to Hillsborough, okay? He arrives, and DeKalb is already here, but DeKalb is camped at Deep River, which is in Randolph County, North Carolina, just south of Hillsborough. Gates comes down, and he decides, I'm taking over, but I want all the Continentals who are still at liberty in the South, come meet me at Hillsborough. He sends out a notice. And as you know, there aren't very many Continentals in South Carolina left, but the few that were met him. On the 25th, he meets DeKalb at Deep River, and guess what? Marion with Ori and 20 others, including servants, meet up with Gates and DeKalb at Deep River. Now, Christine mentioned an earlier meeting with DeKalb I was not aware of. So this was the first I had of Marion meeting with any of them. And there have been lots of information traveling back and forth as to which route did these guys take to Hillsborough. That's why you need the roads and the rivers and all that to look at. And you find out there's a straight shot from this part of the world up to Chirral, and you go straight north to Hillsborough. And in between is Deep River. Now, some say he went around to Bladen County and went up that way. I have not found any evidence thereof. So it gets a little different. So what you're going to see here is, and I'm not going to do 81 or 82, but you know that they're there, is that you have every movement of Marion that is known, all of the events that shape his world, rock his world, and what decisions are made on his brigade. Okay? So it's not purely about Marion. All right, so let's see here. July 27th, they all begin marching towards South Carolina, and they're in North Carolina. So there's the end of July. You got a bunch more battles and skirmishes, but again, none with Marion, but I start showing Marion's camp locations. Now, as I've been discussing with Charles and David Leland, I do not have Marion's letters. I don't have Marion's documentation. And you all know that research is only as good as the sources that you use. Now, I've told you that I use 10,000 pension applications, but I also use Marion's orderly book. I use some works by Patrick O'Kelly. I use books by Mr. Parker, Parker's Guides, and Christine Swigert, and others. There's 75 books that I trust, but I don't have everything. So we all know the more you have, the more you get. And that's the purpose of this, is to show you where the gaps are, show you where the holes are, and let's try to fill this up. So, as again, we know he is at Deep River on these dates. I don't know where he is beforehand, but I hope that one day we will know. Okay, we get to August, and we find out that on the 3rd, they are marching across the PD River at Mass Ferry, which is in Anson County, and Richard Caswell was the former governor of North Carolina. He was the second major general of militia appointed in North Carolina, and he marches with Gates with about 2,200 North Carolina militiamen. And you soon learn that Gates hates militia, and he specifically hated Caswell. He hated North Carolina militia, but he also hated South Carolina militia. On the 10th, Cornwallis leaves Charlestown. He crosses the Santee River at Nelson's Ferry on the 12th, and it gets to Camden on the next day. Date by date. Rutledge. This is very controversial. I have seen numerous references to Rutledge authorizing Marion to take over the South Carolina militia. But Rutledge is back in Hillsborough. So how did he, on this date, I don't know. Is he now a colonel of militia, or is he still a lieutenant colonel in the Continental Line? There are evidence of both. Well, the truth is he's probably both. He won't give up his Continental title, and he is authorized by someone to take over South Carolina militia. Is it real? However, we do have letters from Gates with orders to Francis Marion to go seize all the boats on the Santee River. So they are camped at Rugeley's Mill just before, the day before camping, and Gates sends them south. Go seize the boats. As Christine mentioned earlier, once again, he avoided the Battle of Camden. The story is not about the Battle of Camden. It was a lot on it, but that's it. So, as of around the date of the Battle of Camden, the South Carolina military starts to gel. It hasn't gelled yet. Sumter is over in his neck of the woods, and he assembles 10 regiments under him. And these guys are new. They were created in July. William Polk was from North Carolina. He joined up under him. This is Henry Hampton, there you go. The term brigade really didn't happen at that point in time, but effectively it did. I mean, they didn't start calling it the 1st Brigade or Sumter's Brigade. They just called it Sumter's Group, Sumter's Men, Marion's Men. And you see, this is in yellow to show you that this is where we're talking about, the brigades. You see that there are 7 to 12. And those not along the PD basically just hunkered down. And I'm going to explain this again in the next 2 slides. The check marks means I have proven that they supported Marion in 1780. You look here, and there are 5 regiments that don't want to mess with either one of them. They don't want to mess with Sumter. They don't want to mess with Marion. They want to go it alone. And essentially, there's nothing going on in their neck of the woods. There's a few little loyalist uprisings or what have you, but they decide to go it alone. So here is the beginning of Marion's Brigade, 1780, August 16th, 17th, 18th, somewhere in this time frame. We know that he meets in Kingstree in Williamsburg and meets with the James brothers, and they elect him or what have you. Here's the key thing. We know that there are many sources asserting these units have actively participated. This information mostly comes from the pension applications. But you see that this unit shows Hugh Ory and Peter Ory. Well, these guys basically led these men. And exactly how they divvied them up, I could never sort out. By the end of the year, Hugh moves over to here, because this was where he really belonged. But there wasn't a whole lot going on very early with Richardson because he was still on parole. I think McDonald was still on parole, and I think Abel Cole was still on parole. But some of these guys came off in October, some came off in January. But the Lower Craven County Regiment, the Upper Craven, the Georgetown, as you can see, very few because Georgetown was captured, and then the new Kershaw Regiment, most of these guys in August and July had already started supporting Sumter. So most of these captains were supporting Sumter, but some were supporting Marion. And it's been very difficult to sort out which. Now, what you see is there's 23 companies. These are documented. These captains led men from August to December. But you're going to find out that the timing is not all at once. You could not field 23 companies at one time. He could not field 28 companies at a time. And with the revolving door of militia, they had to keep replenishing it with more and more men. But as my note shows, most of these were lucky to muster 5 to 10 men at a time. So if you use a number of 10 men per company, 115 companies, that's 1,100 men that could be fielded in the second half and proven to work under Marion. This is where it gets difficult. These guys, pension statements, this is 5, that's a typo. Pensioners asserted that they served in these regiments and under Marion in the fall of 1780. That's by golly what I did. They're the only ones that said it. Can't find it in any other documentation. There's no evidence in any battles. There's no evidence in the orderly books. These guys essentially hunkered down where they were, and if they could support Marion, they would. But for the most part, I think they just sat at home. But for the benefit of the doubt, I give it to you that these guys allegedly joined Marion's Brigade in 1780. Now, these did join in January. So January is true. And we all know that Marion was Brigadier General by January, and he was given a specific group of regiments to command, and these are a part of them. But I don't think that they came in 1780. So then the last little tidbit is, here are some guys that said, I was under these regiments or I was under Marion, but they didn't tell you when. Was it 1780, 1781, or 1782? Most of them, I think, actually started in 80, but I just haven't been able to prove it because they weren't in any engagements. It's not a lot, it's only 11 companies, but, you know, for example, these are ex-continental captains, and they're prominent men. I don't know who they served under. I could never piece it together, and I couldn't figure out when. Now, what I wanted to say about this is the beginnings of Marion's Brigade is that every man's name on this chart, we should have a book on. I'm sorry, captains are just as important as brigadier generals. And some of these captains, you know, they're very obscure. But these men served our country, and these men brought our freedom. And they are a footnote. And in most histories, they aren't even mentioned because people didn't take the time to dig it out. Well, we've dug it out. Now it's time for Lancaster County, who's going to produce their next history book to include the right men for Marlborough County, Marion County, Florence County, etc. We need to get these men's names and we need to get some bios on them. And that's why I took this effort. Because my idol, as you all know, or you should know, is Dr. Bobby Moss. Dr. Bobby Moss said, how come we don't know every man who was at Kings Mountain? Well, thanks to him we do, or at least a good majority of them. Well, now we have the opportunity to do the same for Marion's Brigade. All right, moving ahead. I know we're on some time frame. I'm going to try to wrap it up real quickly. August, here's just when we have the notation that they're at Witherspoon. He meets with the King's Tree led by John James, and Marion takes command. Some sources assert that he had no orders from Rutledge. He was elected by the King's Tree folks, and he led only the King's Tree Regiment, which was McDonald's Regiment or Williamsburg Regiment or whatever. I don't think that's true, but I don't really know. When we get the results of Marion's documents, I hope to shed new light on that. Okay? However, on this date, he orders Horry to lead these 4 captains to go take the boats along the Santee, and Marion takes the rest. And they all leave on August 18th. Marion learns of Gates' defeat on the 16th and Sumter's defeat at Fishing Creek, but he doesn't tell his men. Horry learns from his uncle, Elias Horry, and he does tell his men. So, moving right along, 24th, he's camped at Nelson's Ferry. He knows that Captain Roberts is camped at Sumter's Plantation, so we now get to Great Savannah, and what you're going to see on the next 2 slides is more details. Boom, boom, boom. Go through this. So now here's the details that you're really looking for. Who participated in each battle, and what was the name of each battle? Okay, I'm going to get on a quick little aside here and tell you that based on all the resources, there are many names for each battle. There are many dates for some battles. I'm going to give you a quick example. 1781, so we're not there yet. We're only 1780. But there was an engagement at Fairlawn Plantation. Okay, Fairlawn was spelled with 2 words. It was spelled with 1 word. It was Fairlawn Plantation. It was Fairlawn Barony. It was Colleton's Plantation, which was John Colleton, who was previously a Lord's proprietor. It was called Callington's Barracks, because somebody didn't know how to spell Colleton. It was called Callington's Barracks. It was called Monk's Corner. It was called near Monk's Corner. Some dates are there were North Carolinians who participated, and in their pension statements, they came down with the Over the Mountain men in October, and they said the battle was on October 16th. Well, this is a brief little skirmish. But all the South Carolina guys said it was November 17th. Well, a few said the 19th, and a few said the 27th, and a few said the 30th. So you're like, okay. You start figuring out that this event described here by this group is the same event described, so you make a compilation. And in this presentation, you're going to see all the names presented and all the various dates presented, but most likely, and then you're going to find a summary of the engagement. So you've got all that information at your disposal, and that's going all the way through 82 every event. Okay? Now, there's a lot more on each battle, and you can go dig it out in my website or somebody else's, but there's a lot more than just that little sentence. You'll see where it was, based on current counties. So there's a map for every event, and then here's Kingstree number 2. John James was against, you and I would pronounce that Wemyss, but we know it's pronounced Weems. And so there's the first engagement with Weems, a little more of a write-up, the location, and then the monthly calendar. So you see the monthly calendar is filling up again. And you see that we now know this number of Marion's camps. He's here, he's here, he's here, but we don't know where he was here. We know that this is an engagement that Marion led, and we know that this is an engagement that Marion men were at, but he didn't lead. And then here are ancillary battles. So it's like, okay, now you see things in context. What else was going on across the state? Going through September, we get to Gainey, more about Weems, and then we learn that Weems is too strong, so he decides that it's time to get the heck out of Dodge. And you find out here's the order of battle. So here's what's interesting. These guys sort of were the core group that were always with him since the beginning. So a lot of people think, okay, well, he just had lead of the Kings. So there's the location, 1783. And the details do matter, because it's not worth my effort